Welcome to our latest We the People podcast with my co-host Karen. How are you doing tonight, Karen?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing fine. It's hot down here, but that's hot all over the South anymore and out in the West. With us tonight is the newest member of our family, Kim Beach Kenney. Kim is Executive Director of the William McKinley Presidential Library and Museum. Glad to have you with us here tonight, Kim.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Our topic is one that has its roots in the greatest threat this nation survived, the Civil War of 1861 to 1865, and its aftermath. From shortly after the Civil War to well in the last century, statues were erected throughout the South, highlighting those who took up arms against the Union. From Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, to the generic Confederate soldiers' monuments. Those statues, and in the case of the Stone Mountain, Georgia, a stone mural, were all erected. Over the last decade or so, we have started to consider what these monuments mean, especially to those descendants of those who were enslaved, the very cause of the conflict with slavery. What we should do with these remembrances of rebellion has become a divisive issue. Tonight, the three of us will talk about this hot topic. Kim, as another historian like me, why do you think these have become so important to so many in the South?
A lot of people don't understand that most of these statues didn't come to be right after the war. So it happens a lot later, and it's this reimagining of what actually happened. And this reimagining is actually not very accurate. It likes to take slavery out of the picture and to say that, the war was fought over states' rights and the so-called lost cause. And so it becomes this sort of rallying cry that people in the South kind of rally around. And they start to look at these statues as symbols of this lost cause in their past. And it's really not about that at all.
No, they want to talk about, they call it the War of Northern Aggression, because the North came down into the South to fight it. Mm-hmm. They sometimes will say war between the states because that still gives them power as states. But yeah, I think a lot of it's of a romantic version of what the South was. If you look at it, probably the epitome of a movie is Gone with the Wind. Hmm. They imagine this great romantic thing with the huge mansions and the large plantations and the slaves happily singing out there, dressed well, fed well, and all those kinds of things. But the truth of the matter is that only about 3 or 4% of the population of the South had more than one slave. If you did have a slave, usually it was one or two. Another misnomer is there wasn't any slavery in the North, which there was a lot of it as well. Mm-hmm. But yes, I think it's a romantic thing. What do you think, Karen?
It's tough with this because, you grow up and you see these statues and you see them of everybody from George Washington to Christopher Columbus. And I think history in general is kind of whitewashed. And when you're brought up to romanticize these things, it doesn't sound any differently to you. I know, having lived in the South for a long time and meeting Southern people in my early 20s, I had a really hard time understanding where they were coming from because we don't teach it quite the same way up in the North.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, my Southern, besides having my father born in West Virginia and his roots, actually some of them from the Carolinas, my thing of how the South felt about the Civil War was based on Granny from Beverly Hillbillies and how she talked about the war and carrying her gun and the various people of the South. So it was even the romantic part in comedy. Now, as a historian, I think the statues have a place, but when they're in the middle of a town and celebrating being a traitor, you don't have the context of it.
Exactly.
I mean, I think there's places that have the context, places that go with the context. I think, one of the important things is when we look at places where we can have that context, places like where you supervise in there, being executive director of a museum, you have the opportunity to provide the context that a statue sitting in the middle of town doesn't.
Right. And I think it's important to note, too, that these statues were purposefully placed in town squares, in the front lawns of courthouses, in order for people to see them almost without their context, because the context for what they were built for was to sort of tell people what they should think, and that this was an idealized version of our past, and they were put in places where you deliberately had to walk past them. And I think part of the problem is, if I think the problem with our country in general is we don't have empathy anymore. And I think what you need to do is to put yourself in the situation of somebody who is in that town, who has ancestors that were enslaved people, and think about what that would feel like to see a statue to somebody whose whole purpose was to keep them enslaved. And I think you don't have to be a Black person to think about what that feels like, but people don't take that extra step to try to understand why people might feel uncomfortable, or might think that it's inappropriate for these heroes to be honored in these places that are so public. Because the original statues, most of them immediately following the war, are memorials to individuals that are inside cemeteries. That's a whole different thing. And when these start to be erected in the middle of town, it creates a whole different narrative, and it's contextualized on purpose as being this kind of primary place that you would have to go.
Yeah, and I think it's to help intimidate people who want to have a different view of what the war was all about. I mean, one of the things that people don't understand, there still were quite a few people in the South who weren't that thrilled about the secession. You know, and particularly the ones sending their young men off to die. I think we don't realize what that was like for these people. The South did not have, for the average men, they didn't have enough boots. Many of them fought throughout the entire war in bare feet. Now, when I was after I graduated from high school, I was in my hippie stage, and I used to walk in Watertown, New York, where I was born. I would walk barefoot down there. That was uncomfortable in there. I had all these little cuts on my feet, but I wanted to be cool. So I can't imagine what it must be like with the sticks, the stones, the bullets flying and everything, and going over these fences. It had to be, their feet had to be in horrible condition to do it. So, having that kind of situation, I'm amazed that they fought as well as they did. I really am. And fighting for that thing, they had to be convinced that their cause was righteous, and they could not say it's just for slavery. That's why this whole narrative, states, this was a country based on states, not as a unity. So we should have the right to do this. We are protecting our own. And this idea of convincing the people what the Northerners would do to the Southern women and what the Blacks would do if they were free to women. And I think that's a narrative that it continues even in some places to this day.
Yeah, a lot of it's based on fear. Karen and I were talking a lot about that earlier today, about the way that all of this is based on creating fear where there shouldn't be any, or where there actually isn't any.
Yeah, we had friends at church that Karen had known too. And when things started coming up and started the controversy about this, she's big. She wanted to hang a Confederate flag right off the flagpole in front of her house. She doesn't care. She didn't care whether one of the interesting things I find even today is how a lot of people in the South can be so much friends with many people of color, and yet they still have that prejudice on the other thing, particularly for Obama. This one woman said, "Well, Obama isn't exactly the Antichrist, but," and I'm like, "Whoa, come on, let's go with that." But I think, again, go back to the contextual point of it. There is a place where we can have it. It has a context. For many of the statues that aren't huge, we can put them in museums and the museum context, in the actions in an area near the museum where we can have the contextual thing. But for a lot of them, particularly people like Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart, and those people, to have the understanding they really need to be in a battlefield area. Gettysburg is a good place for them. Antietam is a good place for them. Fredericksburg, all these places that they fought. Why don't we pick these statues up? And yes, they are historical, but let's put them in a place where people can learn the context about them. Mm-hmm. And then we're not glorifying what they did. We're saying this is the context you fought in these things. Your cause wasn't righteous, no matter what you want to say, but you fought here. You were heroic in your actions, even those actions were not in a heroic context.
I think a lot of people, though, want they want to believe what they want to believe. Like, I mean, that translates to everything. With Trump and with Southerners in the Northern War, they can't be convinced otherwise. And when you talk about history,
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of like the Bible. People pick and choose what they want to use for their cause. What supports what they're trying to say, instead of looking at the whole of history and how it all ties together, even the ugly parts that we don't want to talk about.
Oh, exactly. And
Mhm.
that is true. I mean, it's hard to convince anybody. You can put all the truth in front of some of these Trump supporters, and they're not going to accept it. Though I think in their heart of hearts they realize what it is, but it's just like the Southerners. It's a lost cause, and they're going to romanticize this lost cause. I mean, you take where the rubber met the road was Charlottesville, when you had the neo Nazis, when you had the white supremacists out there marching. We're not going to give up our lives to Jews. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. And then having that young woman killed by one of those white supremacists, and many people injured when he ran into the crowd. And for the president of the United States to say they were very fine people on both sides. I mean, what kind of statement is that to bring people together?
It's not. It's not designed to bring people together. It's designed to keep people apart. That's what our politics have become today. And I'm not sure how we fix that. I don't know how we get back on track. But we are definitely off the rails about our divisions. And I think it's kind of, you can't put Pandora back into the box now. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure where we go from here. It's actually very disheartening.
It certainly is, for somebody who taught 32 years, and at least 25 of them was taught U.S. history and government. I never would have thought there was a threat to our democracy. I thought we were the shining city on the hill, as they had been described in de Tocqueville, the things that he said about the country in the 1800s. I never could have believed if one of my students would have said, look, we're going to go through a time period where democracy is going to be challenged in this country, I would have said, no, that's not going to happen. It is too ingrained in our soul. But we saw that fall apart in just a 4-year period.
Mm-hmm.
We saw a person be able to sow the divisions that we had, but bring them out in the open that allowed that wound to fester.
Mm-hmm.
But it might be better that it is out in the open, because now people know what people close to them believe. 10 years ago, I had friends that I had no idea were racist. I thought they were good people, and they're racist. There's no way around that. And that makes me pick and choose who I'm willing to interact with, who I want the kids to interact with, who's going to give them the best point of view and the most healthy point of view.
Yeah, and in times when I see the Confederate flag hanging in places, it really ups my hackles and bothers me. And the funny thing is, because my father had been in the South and everything, when I was young, I thought the Stars and Bars was a beautiful looking flag, the battle flag of there. And it does have a certain attractiveness to it. But the connotations that go with it now are so foreign to my inner core beliefs.
Well, then you make a good point in that it was a battle flag, and it was
Mm.
adopted specifically as a symbol of oppression to minority people. This isn't a random flag that's been chosen. This is a specific flag that it's loaded, and you look at it and it's got this meaning. And so it's not a coincidence that this would bother people. It's intentional. It's intentionally chosen to be, a symbol of white supremacy, and white supremacists have adopted it, and kind of it's just ballooned from there. But it was intentional, and it wasn't after the Civil War. It wasn't. It was like the mid 20th century when people started to use those in the state flag. So it's very recent. It's not this kind of heritage that is seamless from 1860 to today. It's this middle time where everybody was scared of the other, and the civil rights movement is happening, and so we start to have these symbols come up. And there's no accident here. This is exactly what they were meant to symbolize.
Well, and the biggest example of that, of course, is Stone Mountain in our own state of Georgia here. I mean, it's the largest statuary representation in the country. I haven't seen it. I would like to see it just to see it. But as I've seen more of it, I don't care if they blast it away because
I think
it's got such a thing. It brings an imagery of romanticism to it that shouldn't be there because it was paid for and put together and designed by people who were involved with the Klan.
they're making changes to it. It was approved this year, in May, I believe. Like they're removing like the trail flags are Confederate flags.
Mhm.
They're removing Confederate things and putting them into like a separate out of the way section. And they're making at least an exhibition, if not like a whole center, talking about Klan history, but not romanticizing it, just talking about it from a historical context. So I
Yeah,
mean, it's small steps, but it's not enough.
that's not enough because whenever a person of color walks anywhere around that great park, and I guess it's a great park, the whole thing is, um, they see the symbols of repression, the symbols that kept them in a state of slavery for all that time. And as romantic as these guys riding, I mean, the whole concept of it actually doesn't even come from modern times and comes from Rome and Greece, where they particularly Rome romanticized the people. They would have the warts and things on them, but they still romanticized them and showed them. But they tried to do this in such a way as to bring that back, but yet it doesn't. Not that we understand it. And I think the frustrating thing for me is I lived the civil rights time. I mean, I was born in 1950. Brown versus Board of Education was in 1954 and beyond. The civil rights laws, the March on Washington, all those things are part of my memory. And as I was saying to them in the other podcast the other day, I had two really bad experiences with the time period. That surprised me. The girl I was going out with at the time, I called her up after Martin Luther King was assassinated because she went to a different school district than I did. She went to North Syracuse. I was in Liverpool. Anyway, she said, I said about what a tragedy, and she says, it's just another, and she used the N word.
Hmm.
That was about another month of our relationship. It didn't last much longer after that. But within days, I'd visited relatives in Pennsylvania. And I'm named after my father. My father was named after his mother's youngest brother, Charles. So, and my great uncle Chuck was a tall man, about 6'3", 6'4", a very imposing man, a very successful man. He had fought with Patton in Italy as a tank commander and a tank group commander as an officer there. But we were sitting around having a picnic at his niece's house, my father's cousin. And not too long after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and he says, in clear blue sky, he says, they caught the man who shot Martin Luther King. And we're all like, okay, I mean, this is big news. He says, yeah, he paid a fine of $20 for shooting a coon out of season.
Wow.
I mean, and it's like a man I admired so much doing that. And that's the concept, as Karen said, people she knows and cared about all of a sudden have a whole different viewpoint than you realize. And how do you deal with that?
It's hard.
I mean, and you even probably see that some of the people come into your museum that have a different viewpoint of some of the things on display.
Sometimes, yes, that happens often. I mean, I have mixed feelings about moving statues to museums. I start to think about what would that mean. We don't want to have a bunch of statues inside in our, galleries. But at the same time, there does need to be some context established. And there's other ways to do that. It doesn't have to be, the statue doesn't have to still exist. And I think that's part of what I get kind of ruffled my feathers about when people talk about losing history when you get rid of these statues. And the other day I said to my friends on Facebook, who gets their history from a statue? And a couple of people said, oh, well, the statues in Gettysburg are important. And I was like, well, yes, that's in a national park where those things happen. That makes perfect
That's right.
sense, as you mentioned earlier. But having these statues kind of out in the middle of town doesn't make sense. And it's not something that people tend to read. And so I feel very strongly that if you're so concerned about losing history, you've got myriad choices of where you can get more
Yeah.
history. If you want to learn more about anything, you can. And I don't think it's reading a plaque on a statue is up there on the list of how people get their history. So it makes me kind of irritated when suddenly history is important, when I run a museum and I'm begging for money every day. And I think to myself, oh, if history is so important to you, come on over and pay some admission and support history in your communities. And how many of you have done that? How many of you who are lamenting this loss of history because the statues come down have ever paid admission to go to a museum, given a donation, any of those things that you can do that actually supports history? So it's loaded for me for sure. But that lost history thing always, it irks me.
It really is. One of the interesting points, your museum, the president, that president, is very, very important. When I was teaching that era, it was America on the world stage began with William McKinley and the Spanish-American War. We suddenly became a world power. And from his administration, we had my favorite president, Theodore Roosevelt, come out. And he was the one who really put us on the world stage. But the beginnings came within that. And you've got the context of how that all began right in there that you could explain.
I mean, if you want to understand any of our foreign policy in the 20th century and into the 21st century, and Karen's seen that firsthand, what are we doing in these other countries? Where does it come from? And that's exactly where it comes from. It comes from the 1890s, from things that McKinley was in charge of. So, he's more relevant today than ever before, but we still, we don't get the kind of respect in the list of presidents as we would like. But we try and we do the best we can with the story we have to tell.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating history. And of course, as one of the presidents assassinated in the 20-year range, everyone had it elected in the 20-year range there for a while. There is a fascinating point, but he should be remembered more for that period of where we went forward from than being an assassinated president.
And we do have a statue. There is a statue of him on our grounds, at his burial site. It makes sense. There was a situation a few years ago where people in a community in California wanted to get rid of their McKinley statue. They very much wanted me to take it. And I just said, we're not a statue museum. We already have a statue. How many statues can you have? So the city of Canton did take it, and it's being repaired. It was actually, there was like acid thrown on it. So it was damaged. And that's the other point that comes up with, this whole talk about statues. They may or may not, we may or may not want them to be there, but there are ways to go about it. You can't just, graffiti, topple it down yourself. Like, you have to have it methodically, voted on by whomever's in charge of these things. And there's a way to go about it. And I think the other point that I wanted to make sure we talked about when they do come down is how cheaply made most of them are. These are not beautiful works of art. These are mass-produced, hollow metal statues. Often, when they do come off their base, either toppled down by people or taken down, they crumble because they're not what people think of as a beautiful statue that you would see in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. These are mass-produced, generic Confederate soldiers, same ones in every community across the South. Often made in foundries in the North, actually. And so, these are not beautiful works of art, which is one of the things that when I teach museum studies course, when I talk about statues, my students are all like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, they're not nice statues. They're just cheap replicas. So, that it's a whole other, get them up quickly so that we can tell this story of this lost cause. That's exactly what happened in the teens and 20s. And then again, in the 50s and 60s, as you're saying, it's a backlash against all of these civil rights movements and anti-immigration and all these things, and that's why these statues are here. They're not here for the reasons that you're told they're here for.
I learned something new today. I did not know that they were cheap.
Not all of them. I mean, some of them.
Oh, well, I know, but if the majority of them are that way, it's like,
stone, marble,
thank
whatever.
you.
But yeah, cheap metal.
That's an interesting concept. I hadn't thought about that, but then I think of when the Saddam Hussein fell apart when they pulled it down. Yeah, that makes sense to me now.
That was made of rock, I think. But
But
you actually brought up something I was thinking about. Do you think that the citizens of Iraq have forgotten the time with Saddam Hussein since there's no statue anymore? The people that supported him, do you think they no longer support him?
Only
you know what
the
I mean?
people,
Like, they still know who he is.
Only the people thinking about him are probably the Al Qaeda type people, because a lot of people don't realize that Al Qaeda came out of the Ba'athist group, his party he was from. Many of their leaders had been generals and officers in his guards, and
Right.
so that's where a lot of it did. And those are the people from his hometown area that maybe still hold any kind of love for him. But I mean, that's another point, and we're getting out of the realm of what we were discussing. But that's a true point, that we probably was one of the biggest mistake we made in this century was going into Iraq on that. We went on a false premise. I mean, he was to blame too. If he would have let them come in and check through and find out there's no, weapons of mass destruction here in his things, but he didn't think we'd do anything. And when he went into Kuwait, no, that's not a very bright thing to do. But it wasn't a necessary thing later on when we did go in over to overthrow him, because he had the most stable, and ironically, he had the most open for gender roles of any of the countries in the Middle East, except maybe Israel. Women could dress, they could the way they want to, they could do whatever they wanted in there. That didn't happen in Saudi Arabia. That didn't happen in Kuwait. That didn't happen in the Emirates. It didn't happen in Qatar. I mean, you know what it was like for women in the Middle East, Karen. What they had to deal with, even you being in the military. There was the limitations because you were female of what you could do.
Not really. Not when I was there. That a lot of that ended in the early 2000s. When I first joined, before I ever went over, yes, that was true. But by the time that I went over in 2007, it wasn't like that anymore.
Okay, they must have liberated it more, but so that was a strange situation. But you're right. I mean, all these places look at these statues. I mean, and you can go for preservation on things, but you can have context with it. Lenin in Moscow, Mao Zedong in China, in Beijing. What's his name too? They had somewhere, I can't remember who it was. They've got preserved his body too. Probably Fidel Castro. I don't know, but where do you take the humanity out of these people and say, okay, they're flawed human beings? They fought heroically for the wrong kind of cause. You can, when people talk about, well, are you going to go after a Washington? Are you going to go after Lincoln? Are you going to go after these people? There's a different context.
But I don't think there's any harm in telling some of the truths, or any of the truth.
No.
Washington had slaves. Yes, that's
yeah.
a horrible thing, but it's the truth.
I think that those types of stories knock these men off their pedestals that they shouldn't be on to begin with. And if you want to talk about trying to make history relevant to people, then you need to talk about the ways in which these people are flawed, because those parts of their personalities are identifiable. And in my line of work is public history, which is, people on vacation. People don't have to sit in my gallery and learn anything. They have to come because they want to. So you need to make that connection somehow, that that what you're doing is relevant to their lives, because they're not captive. They're not a captive audience. It's informal learning, which is different. And so telling those different stories, to me, makes these people more relatable, or you can find something that you understand about them, you can find something that you don't really like. It's a lot more interesting than just this kind of roster of these founding fathers who signed these important documents and we should all be so grateful. There's a lot more to each one of these people, and I think we've only scratched the surface about what we could be telling in some of these men's stories. And
Yeah, and
women, God forbid we add women into the story as well. They were also there.
oh yeah, that's for sure. And some of the people realized that in the time period, some of them didn't. There was a hard sell for women to get their voices heard as part of even the anti-slavery movement.
And I
You
think
know,
it's in the way that we look at what history is, and the records that are left. Traditionally, we value the written word, and women don't write as much as men do. So the story that kind of is handed down in the written record it skews male. So you have to start looking for the stories in other places. And one of the ways you can do that is to look at artifacts and the things that women used and the way that they lived their daily life. So it's harder, but it's not impossible. And so a lot of these stories, I mean, any group that you want to talk about that's not white men, any marginalized group, you have to look harder for their stories, but their stories are there. You just have to learn a different way of looking at it. It's not about reading a document necessarily, it's about reading an object perhaps. And not everybody knows how to do that because that's not something that we generally teach. That's a museum studies, public history kind of, graduate school level way to look at it, but it's how you tease these stories out. It's a lot different than just reading, the interpretation of history by men that left the written word.
that's for sure. Because to fully understand our history, you have to fill it out. And since women are half of the population, and they're the what part of the population keeps it going, that they're an important story. And in most cases, they were a strong supporter. Martha Washington used to come and visit him in places like Valley Forge and in Philadelphia and so on, where he was. She'd come in her carriage and spend some days, and she kept him going when he was having hard times. And then you had Dolly Madison. Her story is far different than most of the other ones. And then even from your own Wells, that the first woman college graduate was from a women's college for the first lady. So there's stories that if you look beyond the basics of the written history, it is fascinating. And I think that the little stories that go with it make it much more interesting for our students. That's what I always try to do, is tell them the story behind the story.
Mm-hmm.
To understand George Washington, the way that I fully understood it was going to Mount Vernon and seeing where he lived and the things that he considered important and the things that he had done. He was a so much more complex man than we see him as the president and as the commander of the revolutionary forces. He had a lot more going for him than that. And it's interesting because you get to know the man a little bit better, or get to know the woman a little bit better if you visit things.
Mm-hmm.
and on it. And that's the thing too. I mean, you have a scarcity of women in the real written record. You're right. I mean, even in your own profession, in directing museums,
Mm-hmm.
you're still somewhat unique. Not as much as you used to be, but you are still somewhat unique.
Yeah, I mean, there are more female executive directors than ever before, but the real power, some argue, lies in the board of trustees and who's on the board. It's not women. It's not half and half. We have, I think, 2 women on our 22-seat board right now. So, there's a long way to go in governance, but in administration, it tends to be, the museum field is a bit pink collar. And there's a lot of women who work in the museum field, but not all of us rise up to this level of administration. But the board, diversity is something that we all need to be taking a look at.
Well, we need to do that across the whole spectrum of what we're looking at. We need to do that. We need to do that in the military. We need to do that in the presidency. I was very disappointed when Hillary Clinton didn't get the presidency. She was probably the most qualified person we've had running for president almost in our history. Teddy Roosevelt's pretty qualified too, and FDR to some extent was qualified, but what she had done was amazing, and to be go through that and through the and let's get back to our main topic here, through the ways of selecting a president, the Electoral College, and the Electoral College was part of this constitutional slavery. Because the states, to get the southern states to agree with the Constitution and ratify it, we had to throw them sops to protect slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And they wanted to have the equal numbers. I mean, you had the 3/5 compromise, you had the compromise on slavery, and then you had the Electoral College. And most people don't realize the Electoral College was just as much about slavery and protecting it as anything else.
So many of the issues leading up to the war, it was all about slavery. It was what, is the state going to be admitted as a free state? Is it going to be a slave state? And then all of a sudden, you're going to turn the narrative around and say it wasn't about slavery after the fact. Like that makes no sense. I mean, when everything leading up to the war had to do with slavery, that's what all those compromises were about. And the way that compromises work is that nobody wins, nobody gets everything they want. And so it was inevitable that we were going to go to war for it. But then afterwards, we're going to sort of not want to admit what it really was about and somehow create this narrative about states' rights when, yes, a state could secede, but they seceded because they were afraid of what was going to happen with Lincoln being president to the institution of slavery. So it's central to what happened to the war. But when you're looking at it from a few generations removed in 1900 and 1910, that's ugly. You don't want to talk about that. You don't want to remember it that way. You'd much rather say, well, it was about states' rights and we were fighting for that. And then here's our statues that we're going to put up to our Confederate dead. And it's very weird, because history is generally written by the victors, for better or for worse.
Yes.
And so when you see, the losers of this war preserving this story, it's bizarre, really. And in other countries, it doesn't happen. So I've only been to the South a few times. I'm a Northerner. I've always lived in the North, so I can't really speak to, the culture firsthand, but I know, it's very different from what I'm familiar with.
Yeah. But see, you can't romanticize slavery. But you can romanticize the heroics of these people in the battlefield. Mm-hmm. But you got to remember what they were fighting for. They weren't fighting truly for states' right. Their states' right was the states' right to have slaves, mm-hmm. no matter what.
Well, and the entire economy was built on that. So
that's right.
You can maybe dilute it a little bit and say, well, they're fighting for their way of life, but their way of life is an economy that's essentially built on slavery. So you can't separate it. It's integral to the whole argument. It just is.
The irony is of it that people don't realize that a lot of the North depended on slavery too, the South slavery, because the textiles and the things that were brought from the South because of cotton up to the North for the products that they sold and exported.
Yeah, so it was all very interdependent.
A lot more than people would want to admit. But again, you can't romanticize slavery.
Well, I know a couple of times in the past I've thought to myself, well, if the South wanted to secede, why didn't we just let them go? And the answer is that our economies were intertwined. Like, mm-hmm. It's always all about money. Spanish-American War wasn't about liberating Cuba. It was about sugar. We're not talking about liberating people in the Middle East. We're talking about oil. It always comes back to money. So this whole idea about states' rights, it's semantics is all it is.
Yeah, it's baloney. I mean, it really is. It's sad that we can romanticize something that is so at the core of having a group of people being considered subhuman. And that's what it is. And unfortunately, for people of color, they can't get away from what they are. When the Irish came here after a few generations, the accents were gone. They changed their last names in some cases, and their first names became Americanized and everything. And they could blend into it. The Polish, the Russians, the Jews, all those people had it. But the people we brought here forcefully did not have the luxury of being able to blend. And unfortunately, we put so much pressure on that they tried very hard to be able to blend. they tried to find ways, if they were a lighter color, to try and deny their blackness. And thankfully, that ended in the 1960s to a large extent. When people started saying black is beautiful with the understanding of everything and the understanding of the culture. So it made a big difference for them. And no longer was straightening hair the thing they all wanted to do. Or successful black women wanting to marry white men. Or successful black men wanting to marry white women to kind of up their status, which pissed off the Southerners too, but that's another story on there. But it is such a complicated thing to say. I mean, when you get right down to it, the whole thing of these statues is, if they're in the center of a square, as we've said many times over this discussion, we have no context for them. It's not, by taking them down, does not destroy the history of what happened. There's lots and lots of ways to find out that history without looking at that statue up there. The statue, as you said, is more of a perfect representation of the people. They probably were not that good looking in person, you know? And there was made portraits and things of them, although by the Civil War there was a lot of photography, but still. So it's not any way that we can find our history in those statues, because they don't have any context with them where they are in the middle of a town. Their purpose for it was not historical. Their purpose was to tell a fable, and that the fable of the lost cause, the heroicness of these men who were underdogs and fighting on for 4 years in a battle that they eventually lost. They didn't lose it because of not trying to win. They lost it because they were overwhelmed. Money, resources, railroads, all those kinds of things that really counted for power, and the ability for the North to keep on putting more men out there than the South ever could. So it's a very complicated thing. Any last thoughts?
I was going to defer to you, Karen. You look like you were going to say something.
No, it's a good discussion to have. You know, we've been in the South talking about statues, and you're like biblical statues, Ten Commandment statues that were brought down in the early 2000s. So it's been interesting to see in the last year or so how many statues have come down properly and also not properly, with people just tearing them down.
And I think a lot of what we've talked about tonight, I think, is the way that you can look at history and make it interesting is that it's many things. It's not all one thing. It's not black and white. There's 1,000 shades of gray. And all of these different stories weave together to tell a truth. And a lot of times when we distill something down to its very basic principles, it renders it false because it's so basic. And there's so many nuances. And what makes history interesting to me is that there's all these different layers, and there's all these different, ways that we can interpret things, and that history is not a single thing. It is a moving, living, breathing thing. And every time we find a new document, we find a new artifact, we think about things in a new way because something else has happened in the world, we get to reinterpret it. And that's not bad. That's actually good, because people think of, well, this happened in the past and we don't get to change it. That's not the way it is, because we haven't heard all the stories, and we still haven't. We've been trying since the 60s to look at social history and start to bring out all of these stories, and we've done a lot of work in that vein, but there's a lot more to do. So every time that I say that in my first class for my students, and their little minds go, you can see it. History is not a fixed thing. No, it's not a fixed thing. It's a very much living, breathing thing. And that's why, there's not one biography about Lincoln. There's hundreds, if not thousands, because there's many different ways to look at the exact same thing by different people. So all these voices need to be heard, and that's what makes history interesting. It's not about, old dead white men fighting wars. There's a whole lot more to talk about.
Says already to conclude, but I've already got a couple other thoughts on this. Saying about so many books on Lincoln, let's look at the number of books on Donald Trump now. Now, those there's so varying viewpoints. All those viewpoints are one thing: the man was not the right person at the right time to be president of the United States. and talking about how to make history interesting and how little things can make a difference. 2 generations away, an adoption changed history in Germany, well, in Austria, actually, because Adolf Hitler's grandfather was adopted. His original family name was Schicklgruber. Have you ever heard that before? His family originally name was Schicklgruber. Now, he was adopted by the Hitler family, and he took the Hitler name. Now, Heil Schicklgruber is just not going to cut it the same way. Adolf Hitler probably would have never been able to get away with what he got away with if his last name was Schicklgruber. It had no ring to it. Heil Schicklgruber just doesn't cut it in my mind. And when I tell that to the kids, they just, like you say, their mouths would just hang up, and it was like, what? Schicklgruber? No. Anyways, Karen's heard this story before, so. Karen's heard all my stories before.
They're new to me.
Yeah, they're new to you. That's wonderful. Another historian in the thing. Last time we had a. Let me go down. No, I can't. I'll tell you after. Okay. On that happy note of all this time, it's been wonderful having you as a guest. We're going to have you actually more participate in some of the ones, and maybe in part of a co-host role too, as we're going on there and things that we all would find interesting, you'd find interesting and want to participate in. So, anyways, thank you very much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And let's see. I got to flip over to my back here. I'm opening up the curtain behind there, like the Wizard of Oz. People are seeing a little bit more what I do. Okay, thank you for listening, all of our listeners. The video from this podcast hopefully will be on our podcast channel on YouTube by tomorrow. Don't forget to check out my website for new material. We the People, the numeral 4, democracy.net. God bless and protect you. God bless and protect our great nation and its legitimate leaders. God bless and protect our essential workers, and bless and protect our troops wherever they are. Good night.